18 months. That is how long the sun disappeared. Not metaphorically, not in the way people talk about hard winters or difficult times. The sun itself stopped working. People woke up every morning for a year and a half and watched a dim, bluish light crawl across a sky that never actually brightened. And they had absolutely no idea why. And nobody came to explain it. And the food was already gone. And the bodies were starting to pile up faster than anyone could count. This happened. It is in the ice. It is in the trees. It is in the DNA of the dead. And somehow, almost nobody alive today has ever heard the name of the worst catastrophe in recorded human history. There is a letter sitting in historical archives that was written in 538 AD by a Roman statesman named Cassiodorus. He was not a poet. He was not a mystic. He was a senior government official writing from Ravenna. And what he described in that letter reads less like political correspondence and more like a man trying to make sense of something that had broken the laws of nature. He wrote that the sun had turned a strange, sickly blue. He wrote that at midday, in the middle of summer, people in Rome cast no shadows. He wrote that the moon had gone hollow and pale, that the seasons had stopped following their own rules, that a winter arrived without storms, and a spring came without warmth, and a summer settled over the land that brought with it no heat at all. He said the sky looked like a stretched hide pulled over the world, a membrane blocking everything. Historians read that letter for 14 centuries and called it dramatic. They filed it under Roman exaggeration and moved on. Nobody ran the numbers. Nobody checked. Nobody thought to ask whether a senior Roman bureaucrat, a man whose job required precision and credibility, might have been doing something radical like writing down what he actually saw. That collective dismissal is not a conspiracy. It is something quieter and in some ways more troubling. It is the institutional habit of deciding that testimony which does not fit the existing story must be wrong about the story, rather than the story being wrong about the testimony. The crack in that consensus came not from a historian, but from a man looking at trees. In the early 1990s, a dendrochronologist named Mike Bailey at Queen's University Belfast was running his finger along the growth rings of ancient Irish oak. Tree rings are not subtle. A good year produces a wide ring. A year of cold, reduced sunlight, or drought, produces a ring so thin you almost miss it. Bailey found, at exactly the year 536, rings that were nearly invisible. The trees had recorded something catastrophic and had been holding that record for 15 centuries without anyone asking them the right question. A second contraction appeared at 542. The biological archive was unambiguous. Something had happened to the sun, and it had happened twice. And it had happened in the exact years that Cassiodorus and a dozen other writers from completely separate corners of the world had described the sky going wrong. The Byzantine historian Procopius, who lived through it, wrote that the sun shed its light without brightness, that every day felt like a permanent eclipse without the drama of one. He was not writing literature. He was a lawyer and a historian recording events for the imperial record. The Syriac patriarch Michael the Syrian, drawing on earlier sources, calculated that the darkness lasted 18 months, and that on the days when light did appear, it lasted roughly 4 hours and arrived without warmth. In China, court records note summer snowfall severe enough to destroy harvests across multiple provinces. The Irish Annals, which are among the most methodically kept records of the early medieval period, log 3 consecutive years without bread, from 536 to 539. In the ancient Persian Book of Kings, an archivist noted that nearly 900 grams of grain could not be purchased for 43 grams of gold. That entry does not sound like poetry. It sounds like a man recording prices in a market where the product no longer existed. These voices were not fringe. They were senators, patriarchs, imperial historians, court archivists writing from Constantinople, Rome, Syria, Persia, China, and Ireland, all describing the same impossible event in the same window of time. And for over 1,000 years, the mainstream reading of history treated every single one of them as embellishment. The question that should make you stop for a second is not what they were describing. The question is why it took a tree in Belfast to make anyone believe them. What the trees confirmed, the ice would later prove with a level of specificity that is almost unsettling. In 2013, a team led by Harvard historian Michael McCormick and glaciologist Paul Majewski drilled a 72-meter ice core from the Colle Glacier in the Swiss Alps. That cylinder of ice contained over 2,000 years of atmospheric history, frozen in layers precise enough to read by the week. Using a laser to carve samples 120 microns thick, roughly 50,000 slices per meter, a graduate student named Laura Hartman found 2 microscopic particles of volcanic glass embedded in the ice at the layer corresponding to early 536. She bombarded those shards with X-rays to identify their chemical composition. The fingerprint matched volcanic rock from Iceland. McCormick's conclusion, published in the journal Antiquity in 2018, was not hedged or cautious. He called 536 the worst year to be alive. A massive Icelandic eruption had thrown enough sulfate aerosol into the upper atmosphere to block sunlight across the entire northern hemisphere. And it had done so without warning, without precedent in living memory, and without any mechanism available to the people living through it for understanding what had just happened to their sky. Here is where the story stops being about weather. The eruption of 536 was not a single event that the world absorbed and recovered from the way civilizations tend to do when nature strikes once and then steps back. A second massive eruption hit in 540. A third followed in 547. 3 catastrophic volcanic events across 11 years, each one compounding the damage of the last before any recovery was possible. Summer temperatures dropped 2.5 degrees Celsius after the first eruption. The second pushed them down another 2.7. Written out like that, those numbers look almost manageable. They are not. A shift of that scale in average summer temperatures does not mean slightly cooler afternoons. It means crops fail. It means frost in June. It means the agricultural systems that entire civilizations had spent centuries building and refining simply stop working. Not for a season, but for a generation. Researchers now call this period the Late Antique Little Ice Age. 124 years of sustained global cooling running from 536 to roughly 660 AD. That name did not exist until 2016. A century and a quarter of climate catastrophe, and it had no name 8 years ago. The famine that followed the first eruption had already been running for 5 years when something arrived at the port of Pelusium in Egypt in 541. It was Yersinia pestis, the same bacterium responsible for the Black Death 8 centuries later. The connection between the volcanic winter and the plague is not speculation. Prolonged famine had compromised immune systems across 3 continents. The climate disruption had pushed rodent populations out of their traditional habitats and into contact with human settlements, carrying infected fleas into communities that had no prior exposure and no resistance. The disease moved fast. By spring of 542, it had reached Constantinople, which was at that moment one of the most densely populated cities in the world, a hub of trade and movement connecting the Mediterranean to the Middle East and beyond. At its peak, according to Procopius, 5,000 people were dying in the capital every single day. Some accounts place the worst days at 10,000. The city's burial infrastructure collapsed almost immediately. Bodies were loaded into the towers of the city walls. When the towers filled, the dead were put on ships, pushed out into the Sea of Marmara, and burned on the water. Mass graves were dug across the city, and still could not absorb what was happening. Roughly 40% of Constantinople's population died in the initial outbreak alone. Emperor Justinian contracted the disease himself and survived, which was remarkable. But what he survived into was no longer the empire he had been building. For years before 536, Justinian had been executing one of the most ambitious military and political projects in late Roman history. His generals had retaken North Africa from the Vandals. His armies were grinding through Italy, pushing toward a reunification of the eastern and western halves of the Roman Empire that had split apart in 476. He was close, genuinely close. The plague ended it. Armies that could not be fed or reinforced could not hold territory. Tax revenues from provinces emptied by famine and disease collapsed the fiscal foundation of the campaign. By 568, the Lombards invaded northern Italy, and the project was finished. What might have been a restored Roman world became the fragmented, localized, memory-poor medieval period that historians would later call, with a vagueness that now seems almost deliberate, the Dark Ages. The darkness had a start date. It had a cause. It had a body count. It was not vague at all. The devastation did not respect geography or political borders. In Mexico, the city of Teotihuacan had a population exceeding 125,000 people at its height, larger than any European city of the same period. Its Pyramid of the Sun, was one of the great architectural achievements of the ancient world, a structure that required generations of organized labor, sophisticated planning, and a stable food supply to build and maintain. Around 550 AD, the city's own residents burned the ceremonial buildings along the Avenue of the Dead. Not an invasion from outside, an uprising from within. Archaeological layers from this period show a sharp increase in evidence of child malnutrition. The volcanic winter had reached the Americas. The crops had failed. The people who were supposed to intercede with the gods, the priestly and ruling class whose authority rested entirely on their ability to maintain cosmic order, had visibly failed at the one job that justified their power. So the people burned the temples. In Peru, the Moche civilization, which had built sophisticated irrigation networks and produced some of the most technically refined pottery in the ancient Americas, collapsed as the climate swung between severe drought and catastrophic flooding, destroying the infrastructure that kept the society functional. In Scandinavia, population loss estimates reach 50% in some regions. Entire settlements were abandoned. Communities that had existed for generations simply stopped leaving evidence in the archaeological record. The Avar Khaganate weakened and shifted. Steppe nomads across Central Asia began moving in patterns that would reshape the ethnic and political map of Eurasia. The Sasanian Empire, already dealing with its own internal pressures, found those pressures multiplied by climate and disease. The Gupta Empire in South Asia fell. On every inhabited continent, within the same narrow window of decades, the same sequence played out. Famine first, then migration, then conflict over whatever resources remained, then collapse, not one after another, not in a chain of causation you could trace from one civilization to the next. Simultaneously, a global civilizational reset, and the mechanism was ash in the upper atmosphere, and a bacterium in a flea on a rat on a ship in the Egyptian delta. The plague returned in waves for over 2 centuries. The last recorded cases appeared around 750 AD. By then, the ancient world was not just changed, it had been forgotten. There is something specific that happened in Scandinavia during this period that most accounts of 536 skip past. And it deserves its own space because it reveals something about how human beings respond when the world stops making sense. In 1999, a Danish archaeologist named Morten Axboe published a paper in the journal Medieval Archaeology examining gold hoards from the migration period, large deposits of gold objects found buried across Scandinavia, dating to the late 5th and 6th centuries. The standard interpretation of buried treasure assumes concealment for safekeeping, that someone hid their wealth intending to come back for it. But these deposits had no markers, no retrieval system, no indication that whoever buried them expected to return. Axboe connected the timing of these deposits directly to 536 and made an argument that is simple and devastating. The Scandinavian elite were not hiding their gold. They were giving it to the ground. They were burying their most valuable possessions as offerings, as sacrifice, as a prayer to whatever power controlled the sun, asking it to come back. Think about what that means for a moment. An entire ruling class across a vast, geographically dispersed region, people with no shared political authority or communication infrastructure, arriving independently at the same conclusion, that the only option left was to surrender everything they had to the earth and hope. When those gold hoards are found today, they are not treasure. They are the physical shape of desperation. They are prayers that did not work, preserved in soil for 15 centuries, waiting for someone to understand what they actually were. The ice core record adds its own layer to this picture. After 536, lead pollution in the Colle Neferi core drops to nearly zero. Lead enters the atmosphere as a byproduct of silver smelting, and silver smelting happens when economies are active, when mines are running, when trade is moving metal from one place to another. When the lead vanishes, it means the economic machinery has stopped. Not slowed, stopped. And it does not return until approximately 640 AD, 100 years. A full century of economic silence, not estimated from fragmented texts or inferred from the absence of artifacts, but measured directly in the chemistry of alpine ice that has been accumulating layers since before Rome existed. By 660, a new lead spike appears, and researchers have traced the origin of the metal driving that recovery to a specific mine in Mel, in the Aquitaine region of what is now France. The entire monetary system of Western civilization shifted during this period from gold currency to silver. That transition, which reshaped commerce, taxation, and political power across medieval Europe, has its origin point in a specific place, at a specific moment that you can identify in ice. There is one more thread here, and it is the one that stayed with me longest after going through the research. In 2007, Swedish archaeologist Bo Gräslund published work arguing that the events of 536 were the direct historical basis for the Norse myths of Fimbulwinter and Ragnarök, 3 successive winters with no summer between them. The death of the sun, the collapse of the gods, the end of the world. Those are not abstract mythological concepts invented by poets sitting comfortably by fires. They are descriptions. They are what 536 looked like from the ground when you were a farmer in Scandinavia, watching the sky stay dark, and your children grow thin, and half the people you knew disappear before the third winter arrived. Gräslund and his colleague Neil Price expanded and refined this argument in 2012 and again in 2015. They documented something that I find genuinely difficult to move past. After the end of the 6th century, the sun symbol disappears from Scandinavian art. It had been a constant motif for generations, carved into stone, pressed into metal, woven into cultural expression across the region. After 536, they stopped. Not gradually. They stopped. As if the memory of what the sun had done, or failed to do, was something that could not be depicted without reopening something too painful to touch. Then, in January 2025, researchers at the University of Copenhagen published findings about a Neolithic site on the Danish island of Bornholm, dating to around 2900 BC, nearly 5,000 years ago. During an earlier volcanic event, the people living there had sacrificed hundreds of flat stones carved with sun motifs. The senior researcher described it as evidence that offerings honoring the sun are an ancient human pattern repeated across millennia. Humans watching the light fail and burying what they love most in the ground, in the hope that it will return. That pattern did not start in 536. It did not end there either. It stretches back to before writing, before cities, before any of the things we use to measure civilization. The catastrophe of 536 dropped into a groove that was already worn deep into human behavior. The late antique Little Ice Age lasted 124 years. It ended the Roman reunification, collapsed cities larger than medieval London, triggered the first bubonic plague pandemic, erased 50% of some regional populations, and rewrote the global economy. It has been confirmed by dendrochronology, glaciology, ancient DNA analysis, and atmospheric chemistry. It did not have a name until 8 years ago. Cassiodorus wrote his letter in 538 and described all of this with the precision of a man who understood that nobody would believe him. He was right for nearly 15 centuries. The trees knew before we did. The ice held the answer before anyone thought to ask it. The gold buried in Scandinavian soil is still there in places, still holding the shape of a prayer that was never answered. If something in this video made you stop, if a detail landed differently than you expected, or if you found yourself wanting to know more about a specific moment we covered, drop it in the comments. Not a generic reaction, tell us which part actually got to you. Because the people watching this are the kind of audience that notices things, and those conversations in the comments end up being genuinely worth reading. If you want to be part of what we build here, subscribing takes 2 seconds and it means you will actually see the next one when it goes up. We are covering stories that do not get covered, and we are just getting started. Is there a collapsed civilization, a forgotten catastrophe, or a piece of erased history you have been wanting to see explored properly? Tell us. That might be the next video.